Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our webinar on disparities in debt, understanding a case for economic equity, sponsored by Wells Fargo. My name is Linda Williams. I am a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action and your host for the day. And on behalf of Consumer Action Executive Director Anna Flores and the entire staff at Consumer Action, welcome. We have a lot to cover today, and I am so excited. I am pumped about the conversation that we are about to have on disparities in debt, understanding a case for economic equity. And joining us today is Shehryar Nabi. Shehryar is a senior research associate with the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. Also here with us today is Adam Ruege. He is the Director of Strategy and Evaluation for Community Solution, an organization that works to achieve a lasting end to homelessness. Also here with us is Dr. William Rodgers III. Dr. Rodgers is the Vice President and Director of the Institute for Economic Equity at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Are you strapped in? Are you strapped in? If not, buckle up and get ready because we are bringing the fire today. Now, before I get into the program, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. This is a 90-minute webinar. If you have any questions for our guest professionals, please put them in the chat box. At the end of all presentations, my coworker Nelson Santiago, he's going to facilitate a question and answer segment. This is where we get to hear from you now, so help us keep that conversation moving with your questions. The webinar is being recorded, and it will live in perpetuity on our YouTube channel. You will receive a link to the recording and all handouts by tomorrow afternoon, if not sooner. AFC professionals, you will receive the password to claim your 1.5 CEUs tomorrow afternoon as well. Now, at the end of today's webinar, you will receive a survey regarding today's session. Please complete the survey and return it to us as soon as possible. Now, in addition to attending today, as a bonus, you will receive a certificate of completion. Now, for those of you who are new to Consumer Action and are wondering, what do they do over there at Consumer Action? Well, we are an educational and advocacy organization. What do we do? Through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness for all consumers nationwide, but especially for those marginalized, underrepresented consumers. When you're on our homepage, you see that little burgundy red looking link in the middle? Click on that link and you will land on our COVID-19 educational project page. There you will find a ton of relevant, easy to use resources and tools that you can use in your community that will serve your community. So now let me go over the agenda quickly so you'll know where we're headed today. We open each and every training, whether it's virtual or in person with the game, how much do you know? Today we have 3 true or false questions. After the game, I will introduce you to our guest speakers in the order that they will present to you. The question and answer segment by Nelson Santiago will follow. I will come back, tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action, and wrap up. Now, this is how the game is played. There are 3 true or false questions. First, I will read the question and you will use the chat box to answer each question. Then, after I close the poll and take a look at the results, I will tell you if the statement is true or false and why. And the person with the most correct answers, drum roll please, he or she will receive the bragging rights. Still, how much do you know? So let's roll out that first question. True or false? In a 2021 report, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that credit report disputes are common in majority Black and Hispanic communities. Is that true or is that false? In a 2021 report, the CFPB found that credit report disputes are common in majority Black and Hispanic communities. Is that true or false? Don't overthink it. Couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll. Let's take a look at the results. Wow, 69% of you think that is a true statement, and 31% you think it's a false statement. Actually, that statement is true. The CFPB's 2021 report shows that most Black and Hispanic neighborhoods continue to face significant challenges with inaccurate credit reports. In nearly every credit category reviewed, auto loans, student loans, credit card, and retail cards, consumers living in majority Black areas were more than twice as likely to have a dispute on their credit report. Okay, you're doing good. Let's move on to the next question. Question 2 is about the impact of traffic fines and fees on low-income families. Okay, true or false? In 13 states, failure to pay a traffic ticket is a misdemeanor punishable by jail time. Wait a minute, is that true or false? In 13 states, failure to pay a traffic ticket is a misdemeanor punishable by jail time. Is that true or false? Couple more seconds. Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. Wow, 87% believe that's a true statement. Only 13% think that statement is false. Actually, audience, that is a true statement. According to a 2022 article that appeared in The Atlantic, in 13 states, failure to pay a traffic ticket is a misdemeanor, punishable with jail time. In 34 states, missing a payment means losing your driver's license. And in a country where 80% of adults drive to work, losing your license can mean losing your job and any resources to ever pay off a ticket. Now, a link to that article is going to be included in the materials that you will receive tomorrow. But interesting enough, the article argues that if the United States followed the model of European and Latin American countries, where penalties are levied using an income graduate or day fine model, under the model, people who break the law, they will pay a fine, but the fine would be equivalent to a percentage of their income rather than a flat fee, thus creating equity for all. You'll get that article tomorrow, and you can let me know by sending me an email what you think. Okay, so you are doing great. We have one last question to go over. Let's roll out the last question. Question 3, our last question, is about the role of community-based organization in fostering economic equity. Okay, here's the question, true or false? There is no role for CBOs in fostering economic equity in LMI communities. CBOs should just explain and let the government do its job. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. There is no role for CBOs in fostering economic equity in LMI communities. CBOs should just stay in their lane and let the government do its job. Is that true or false? Okay, let's close the poll, please, and take a look at the results. Wow. Only 6% believe that is a true statement. 94% of you think that statement is false. 94%? You're absolutely right. According to a study conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank, organizations working in LMI communities represent an essential part of the infrastructure that promote economic resilience and mobility for all. Thank you so very much for playing the game. And let's move on. But before we get into the presentations, I would like to recognize a special guest speaker, a special guest here with us today. His name is Lawrence Baldish, and Lawrence is with Wells Fargo, and this webinar is being presented with funding from Wells Fargo. We want to thank Wells Fargo for trusting in us and believing us enough to give us funds for this webinar. Lawrence, are you there? Would you like to say a few words to our audience?
I am. Sorry, it took me a second to come off mute. Thank you. And I won't hold y'all any longer than you need to be held. This is an important topic to get into. I just wanted to share, income inequality receives a lot of attention when looking at disparities in socioeconomic outcomes. While it's vitally important, that's often done at the expense of looking at other fundamental issues like disparities in debt and wealth. In general, when you look at the Survey of Consumer Finances and some other sources we know about people's household income and wealth, only about 2/3 of household wealth outcomes are tied to their household income. The rest is due to behaviors and inheritances, etc. Some of those are due to how different groups, particularly those in different ethnic and racial groups, interact with debt and wealth. And largely, those behaviors are not freely made decisions. They're the consequence of historical pressures that have forced primarily non-white groups into specific types of debt and wealth instruments. Here at the Wells Fargo Foundation, where we primarily focus on housing and small businesses and financial health, we're striving to foster and develop systems that promote greater equality and solve some of these disparities. From projects that work to change narratives on the local level, advocating for greater equality and working against predatory practices on the federal level, to ones that directly support one-on-one interventions for individuals that need them. We're working to address systematic issues in our economic system. And that's why we're pleased to be able to offer these welcoming remarks and support consumer action in this webinar. As Linda suggested, we've got some great panelists lined up across the public and private sectors, and I'm raring to learn more. So let's get it started. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you for those remarks. Now, let me introduce you to our fantastic panel. Shehryar Nabi. He is a senior research associate at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, where he analyzes data and conducts research on household financial well-being in the United States. His work covers a wide range of topics, including but not limited to affordable home ownership, equitable retirement access, financial inclusion, debt, and income security. As part of the Future of Wealth initiatives, he has identified evidence-based solutions and have created a framework for measuring progress toward broadly shared opportunities to build wealth. Welcome to the webinar, Shehryar. Adam Ruege is here. Adam is the Director for Strategy and Evaluations for the Built for Zero team at Community Solutions. In this role, he is responsible for creating and constantly improving an approach to organizational learning across all Built for Zero portfolios, while also leaning on knowledge capture and disseminated for target strategic learning questions. Prior to joining Community Solutions, Adam worked with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs and the National VA Homeless Program Office. He has over 20 years of experience working on homelessness and as a direct service provider, as a manager leading programs locally and in the National VA office. Welcome to the webinar, Adam. Also, joining us today is Dr. William Rodgers III. He is the Vice President and Director of the Institute for Economic Equity at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Before joining the Feds, Dr. Rodgers served as a professor of public policy and chief economist at Rutgers University. His area of expertise include compensation, pay equity, diversity and inclusion, labor market, and general economic trends. His area of expertise include compensation, pay equity, diversity, and labor market trends. Dr. Rodgers is an elected member of the National Academy of Social Insurance, and he served as the academic board chair for the last 5 years. He also served as a treasurer for the Institute for Women Policy Research. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Rodgers. Now, let's get ready to rumble, so to speak. Let me turn this webinar over to Shehryar. Shehryar, you have control. So we are ready to learn more about disparities and debt on the other side of the wealth gap and the impact that could have on low-income families. So Shehryar, take it away.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, hi, everyone. It's great to be talking with you all today, and I want to thank Consumer Action for hosting this session. I'm Shehryar, and I'm, as we said earlier, I'm Senior Research Associate with the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program, And today I'm going to talk about racial debt disparities in America, how they affect the ability of families to build wealth, and conclude with solutions for what we can do about it. Much of what I'll say about debt in this presentation is discussed in our report from last year titled Disparities in Debt: Why Debt is a Driver in the Racial Wealth Gap. The information in this report also reflects a combination of original analysis of publicly available data and a synthesis of existing research. First, I want to say a little bit about the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. Our mission is to illuminate and solve the most critical financial challenges facing American households and to make financial security for all a top national priority. We aim for nothing less than a more inclusive economy with reduced wealth inequality and shared prosperity. Could I get the next slide, please? I'm not sure I have control over them. Sorry, one moment. Okay. So before we talk about debt and disparities in debt holding, I want to start this presentation by talking about the importance of wealth when it comes to financial security. We can't have a complete understanding of debt without talking about wealth, which is represented by your assets minus your debts. We see wealth as delivering 5 critical benefits. Resilience. Wealth protects, cushions, and stabilizes people when they experience sudden expenses or shortfalls in income. Investment in mobility. Wealth can be invested to boost cash flow, reduce the cost of living, and generate even more wealth. Intergenerational support. Wealth allows people to endow the next generation with resilience, mobility, and opportunity. Mental and physical well-being and quality of life. Having wealth reduces financial stress and gives people more agency. And finally, ownership, voice, and control over assets and institutions. Asset ownership gives people a decision-making role and boosts social and civic engagement. So we at the Aspen Financial Security Program decided to focus on wealth because over our years of work, so many of the solutions we've identified to boost financial security lead back to wealth building. So now I want to share a couple of charts showing the state of wealth in this country today, and also showing that people with the least wealth face barriers to building it. As you can see, the bottom half of people in the wealth distribution have just 2% of the nation's total wealth, while the top 10% have about 70% of the nation's total wealth. Wealth is also unequally held along racial lines. As of 2019, for when we have the latest and best wealth data, median wealth for white households was about $189,000, 8 times that of Black households and 5 times that of Latino households. These gaps are the product of centuries of discriminatory policies whose impacts are felt to this day. Financial precarity is also widespread, which can make debt particularly disruptive when people are already struggling with their expenses. 2 indicators that we look at to gauge this are routinely positive cash flow and short-term savings. Just about half of households have routinely positive cash flow, meaning that they were earning more than they spent, allowing room in their budgets to save. Black and Latino households were significantly less likely than white and other race households to have routinely positive cash flow. Our second indicator shows that many families also struggle to build savings buffers. In 2019, only 45% of households had 6 weeks of income in savings, which research from the JP Morgan Chase Institute has defined as sufficient for being able to weather a simultaneous expense spike and dip in income. and having this amount of savings was far less likely for Black and Latino households. In this context, debt can derail the ability to meet immediate needs and grow wealth. When people don't have routinely positive cash flow, they may be more likely to take on debt for regular expenses. And when people lack short-term savings, debt payments could siphon resources away from building wealth in the long run. With that in mind, let's examine the aggregate picture of household debt. As you can see in this chart, household debt is vast and growing, with current levels at $17 trillion as of this year. The bulk of that is in housing debt, but a large and growing portion is in non-housing debt, which is more likely to include the kinds of debts that can be harmful and burdensome, such as student loan debt and medical debt. I also want to call attention to the growth of households that have more debt than assets, putting them in negative net worth. As of 2019, 1 in 10 of all households had negative net worth, which is still higher than pre-recession levels. This was initially related to the huge loss in home values among households that still carried mortgage debt after the Great Recession. But as the housing market recovered over time, the rise in student loan balances appears to explain why negative net worth remains elevated above pre-recession levels, as more than 70% of households with negative net worth carried student loans, compared to 21% of all households. Now we're going to zoom in to look at the racial disparities in debt, followed by a discussion of how particular kinds of debt can be harmful. This table shows the percentage of households holding debt by racial and ethnic group per the latest survey data available. If you look at the top row, we see that households of color are the least likely to have mortgage debt, which is often thought, though not always, considered a good debt when it enables homeownership, which is a huge source of wealth for most families. Looking at the third row and last row, Black and Latino households are more likely to have credit card debt and other debt, which often includes riskier forms of debt that I'll talk about in the next slide. Looking at the second to last row, where it says education loans, we also see that 30% of Black households have student loan debt, making them the highest among all racial groups to carry them. I want to highlight some other important racial disparities in debt. Black, Latino, and other race households are more likely to have medical debt than white and Asian households. Communities of color are more likely to have debt in collections. A study of 9,000 cities found that cities with the highest share of Black residents collect, on average, 5 times more revenue using fines than cities with the lowest share of Black residents. When people are unable to pay them, these fines can become a burdensome form of debt. Finally, while not debt per se, credit is deeply related to debt, and communities of color are much more likely to have subprime credit than white communities. There is also racial disparity in who has negative net worth. Almost a fifth of Black households have negative net worth, which is much higher than all other racial groups. Now that we have a broad picture of the racial disparities in debt, I want to discuss the specific ways that debt can be harmful and impose a barrier on building wealth. I want to start this discussion with a quote from a participant in a focus group on debt we held in 2018 that illustrates the lived experience of having debt. So they said, "Psychologically, it's a burden. It affects quality of life in a negative way. It causes stress, it causes anxiety, because it's an obligation. You just can't ignore it because there'll be consequences. Your credit score, they may take things away. You can lose a house, they have foreclosure." I think it's important to emphasize how stressful having debt can be at a personal level, particularly when it's harmful. In the following slides, I'm going to be sharing some evidence on the specific harms associated with different kinds of debt. And while these harmful debts are experienced by people of all backgrounds, we are more likely to see them among people of color. One of the most financially damaging debt challenges that people experience is having debt in collections, which we discuss in detail in our report titled A Financial Security Threat in the Courtroom. About 64 million people with a credit record had debt in collection on their credit report. And as we noted earlier, this is more pronounced in communities of color. Having debt in collections can lead to the creditor suing the person with the debt, who is likely to lose the case. Millions of consumer debt lawsuits are filed each year, and multiple studies have found that more than 70% of debt collection lawsuits end in default judgments against the individual just for not responding to the filing of the lawsuit, even if they would have had a legitimate defense. Default judgments can have some serious consequences, such as bank account seizure, wage garnishment, severely damaged credit scores, difficulty borrowing in the future, and the threat of imprisonment. Available evidence also shows that there are racial disparities in who receives debt collection lawsuits. A study of St. Louis, Chicago, and Newark found that court filings were twice as high in Black communities as in white communities, even after accounting for income. Student loans. While they can be a source of economic mobility for those who can earn enough to pay them off, they can also impose barriers to building wealth. First off, the amount of outstanding student loan debt is huge at $1.6 trillion. Multiple studies have shown that carrying student loan debt can delay wealth building goals, including homeownership, retirement savings, and business formation. I want to highlight that Black households with student loan debt carry a median of $30,000, which is significantly higher than other racial groups. Recent research also shows that for far too many people, and especially people of color, loan balances are exceeding the original amount because of difficulty keeping up with payments and accrued interest. This increases the duration of student loan repayment, as well as the risk of default. To illustrate this, research has found that 78% of student loan balances in area where Black people are a plurality exceeded the original amount owed, compared to 63% in Latino areas and 54% in white areas. The racial gap in loan repayment reflects wage inequality, less family wealth, and discrimination in hiring, among other factors. Now looking at medical debt. The burden of medical debt can be severe, leading people to forego the essentials. The United States has an estimated total of $195 billion in outstanding medical debt, with 1 in 10 households owing at least $250, which recent research set as a threshold for having a significant amount of medical debt. A recent survey found that medical debt affected people's financial lives in multiple ways, the top 3 being that over 60% had to cut back on essentials like food, clothing, and basic household items. Nearly half used up all or most of their savings to pay down the debt, and 40% increased their credit card debt for non-medical purchases because of their medical debt. And for all of these impacts, Black and Latino adults surveyed were more likely to experience them. The survey also found that medical debt can prevent access to care, worsening health. So many people might have been denied care because of their debt, and more frequently, people skipped or delayed care or medication because they didn't want to take on more debt. Court-ordered fines and fees, such as traffic violations and justice system proceedings fees, can create significant hardships for people with few resources. Fines and fees are also a way for municipal governments to make up for budget shortfalls. To get a sense of scale, a recent survey found that 1 in 3 people in the US has received a court-imposed fine or fee in the last decade, and these fees typically range from tens of dollars to hundreds of dollars. Fines and fees have been shown to be damaging for those who are financially vulnerable. Surveys have found that fines and fees can impact the ability to pay for housing, to pay for food, employment, and the ability to afford education. Fines and fees can damage credit scores if unpaid and sent to collections. Fines for traffic violations can also lead to driver's license suspensions, affecting mobility and the ability to connect to jobs. In addition to the study I shared earlier, multiple studies that look at the local level have found racial disparities in fines and fees. Finally, let's look at barriers to building credit. Good credit is important for obtaining safe loans for wealth-building assets like a home or a small business loan, as well as access to other quality financial services. However, we also see racial disparities in credit access with big consequences. Communities of color are more likely to have subprime credit. Median credit scores are much higher in white communities. Black and Latino people are also more likely to be credit invisible, meaning they don't have enough information to have credit reports at all. Now, the reasons for these disparate outcomes and the reasons for lacking credit include lower incomes, fewer financial services available, and also carrying riskier debt, all of which can negatively affect credit scores. I also want to add, like we saw with the question at the start of this session, disputes of inaccurate information on credit reports are more likely in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Okay, so, the conversation on debt disparities and their consequences can be kind of a downer. So I wanted to include this presentation on a hopeful note by looking towards solutions. So first, we saw the benefits of implementing meaningful solutions during the pandemic. These solutions included things like student loan forbearance, eviction bans, stimulus checks, and the advanced child tax credit. And we can briefly review their benefits. So student loan forbearance, borrowing, that slashed the amount of borrowers with growing loan balances pretty dramatically. Credit scores improved over the course of the pandemic. 60% of recipients of the second stimulus check used it to pay down debt. And then the advanced tax child credit lifted millions of people up from poverty and dramatically reduced child poverty. However, many of these programs are expired or are set to expire, and a lot of these gains are being lost. So new solutions should make them sustainable. In our recent report titled The New Wealth Agenda, we lay out a blueprint for massively growing the wealth of households in the bottom half of the wealth distribution and people of color by 2050. We start this agenda with a North Star vision that we must increase by tenfold the wealth of households of color and those in the bottom half of the wealth distribution in the US by 2050. To support those who share our goal of widespread household financial security and inclusive wealth building, we've identified 8 objectives that we believe provide the most effective and most promising paths towards our transformative goal. I want to call out 2 of the objectives that are directly related to disparities in debt. Number 2, debt resolution, focuses on reducing harmful debt. And number 4, wealth building career pathways, focuses on making higher education affordable so that people don't have to take on burdensome amounts of student loans. Now I'm going to review some of the solutions we offer in our report that are related to debt. Our report doesn't include all the solutions that may be needed, but rather it focuses on those that we think will have the most impact given our review of the evidence and the scale needed to achieve the objectives and our North Star vision. We also offer these solutions not as a prescription, but more as an invitation to be bold in our thinking. So to shortly go over some of these. So our priorities should include reducing the burden of federal student loans through reforming income-driven repayment and enacting at least $30,000 of student loan forgiveness. And we could also reduce the cost of higher education by increasing public investment in higher education institutions, offering free tuition plans, and increasing the size of Pell Grants. Many of you have probably heard there's been some movement on these issues recently with the recent Supreme Court ruling and the Biden administration's announcements affecting some of these policies. So just wanted to note that. We can reduce medical debt by reforming health systems so that insurance is universally affordable, require more charity care, and build on recent actions by the credit bureaus to limit the damage of having medical debt on credit scores by establishing a higher ceiling on medical debt that can be referred to collections. And we can enact comprehensive debt collection reform by putting more requirements on collections lawsuits, strengthening borrowers' ability to defend themselves, limit the impact of judgments, and improve the government's ability to enforce debt collection laws. Some further solutions when it comes to debt include inclusive credit scoring, regulating high-risk loans like payday products and vehicle title loans, reducing the burden of government fines and fees, and finally, to also focus on strategies to grow income and assets, such as increasing minimum wages and also increasing access to early wealth building accounts, such as baby bonds and children's savings vehicles. So this is just a preview of the full suite of solutions we offer in our report, which in addition to identifying solutions, provides a way for us to measure progress towards achieving them. For more detail, please see our report, The New Wealth Agenda. So I hope this presentation has been informative for you. I'd like to invite all of you to use this information in these slides to inform your work and also dig into the reports available on our website where these issues are talked about in greater depth. Thank you for listening.
Shehryar, thank you for that excellent presentation. If you have any questions for Shehryar, put them in the chat box. Now let me turn the webinar over to Adam so we can learn how disparities in rent can lead to homelessness. Adam, you should have control of, Thank you.
Yeah, I sure do. Thank you, Linda, and thank you to the Consumer Action team that invited me to present during this call. So my name is Adam Ruege, and I just really pleased to be able to present what we're learning around debt, the impact of debt and homelessness. That, you know, in listening to the last presentation, which was absolutely wonderful, you're going to hear a lot of the same themes. You're going to hear a lot of the same things that were spoken about. And this, you know, what we're going to show, what I'll showcase is how it is impacting some of the most vulnerable people in our country. So, you know, like I said, my name is Adam Ruege. I'm the Director of Strategies and Evaluations here at Community Solutions. Community Solutions powers the Built for Zero movement. Built for Zero is a network of over 100 communities in the United States and 4 international countries dedicated to reducing and ending homelessness. Let me go back there, just trying to figure out my slides there. So, you know, we believe, you know, at Community Solutions, we believe that homelessness is solvable. It's not just manageable, it's solvable. And that, you know, we've seen evidence that communities, if they align their resources, if they take a racially equitable lens to the challenge, if they can get behind one shared aim and goal, that homelessness can be reduced and ended. It may not seem like that in the media. You know, we are seeing right now in some of our communities in the West Coast, especially, some of the largest increases in homelessness in quite some time. And the situation seems quite dire, but we believe that through the work that we do and our other national partners and communities are doing, that this is a complex social problem that can be solved. So like I said, we work with over 100 communities in the United States, from very small rural communities in the South to some of our West Coast urban centers, to adapt what we call the Built for Zero model, which is a model that it uses a public health complex systems approach to the challenge, right? With the belief that complex social problems require system solutions. So how we got involved in the work around debt and understanding debt, because of the work that we do with communities, we want to really understand what are the key drivers of homelessness, right? And there's not ever one thing. There's multiple factors that contribute to people entering homelessness. It may be, housing costs increasing. It may be, coming out of institutions like coming from incarceration, or maybe, any number of things. But we decided to really dig into this debt issue because it continued to come up within our community. So I'm going to speak a little bit more to that here in a minute. What we do here at Community Solutions and Built for Zero is we provide technical assistance. We provide in the form of coaching to communities. We do provide some financial support, which I'll get to in a moment, to help those communities reduce and end homelessness. So again, we don't just help support communities on managing the crisis, but actually end it. If you go to our website, community.solutions, you can find a bulk of resources about our model and the work that we do at communities. So I want to just speak to some work that we have been doing around this issue around debt and homelessness, really to understand, what are the key drivers to these increases in homelessness that we're seeing. The research is very clear. It's very aligned with what was just spoken about, is that there is a major disproportionality when it comes to debt, especially when you start looking at rental debt and then other types of debt that contribute to homelessness. So 3 key things. Debt, and this is from the Eviction Lab. If you're not familiar with the Eviction Lab's work, I encourage you to Google their websites. Fabulous amount of information available through their website and research. But we know through this research from them and others that debt contributes to and prolongs homelessness. And we know that non-payment of rent is one of the most common reasons for evictions, and that can lead to homelessness, and that the accrual of rental debt makes it more difficult for individuals and families, once they've entered into homelessness, to get out of it. We've also seen, through some research, that not only does it contribute to the increase in homelessness, but it also prolongs homelessness. There's been a couple of studies coming out of Seattle that shows that those experiencing homelessness in that city who had legal debt experienced nearly 2 additional years of homelessness when controlling for other factors. That was a very similar finding around medical debt. So debt is a contributor to not just the individual and family homelessness, but prolonging that homelessness. So how do we get involved with this, looking at this more deeply? Like I said, one of the things that we do here in Community Solutions is we provide what's called pass-through funding. Pass-through funding are grants that we provide directly to communities. We have that we receive from foundations such as MacArthur Foundation, Home Depot Foundation, and others. And we provide that money directly to communities to help support them in reducing and ending homelessness. One type of funding that we provide, it's called flex funding. It's unrestricted funding that we provide to communities, with the idea that this funding can be used to fill any gaps that more traditional funding can't serve. Over the last few years, as we've provided this funding to communities, the majority of that flex funding has actually been used to pay off debt arrears. It's astounding the percentages of funding that we provide in flex funds that have gone to pay down rental debt. And we also heard from communities that in our network that they were seeing very clearly that families and individuals of color who were experiencing homelessness that also had debt arrears were predominantly people of color, right? And that they had much higher debt burdens than those that did not. So that's why we dug into this. And so on our website, you'll see that we have a learning brief around this issue, which I'm going to cover the highlights during this call, that goes into much more detail around what the research says around rental debt and other types of debt, and how it contributes to homelessness and prolongs homelessness. This, especially now as across the country, housing costs are increasing. And that's true for mortgage or for housing values, as well as rent costs. People are getting marginalized even further, right? And then when you add on the debt burdens, it becomes more and more difficult, not only for people to afford housing, but also to pay down the previous debt that they may have had to get into housing. So the situation is quite dire situation, it seems, in many communities because of that. So a couple of resources that we dug into when we were looking at this issue, and one of the key pieces of evidence that we discovered through research from both academic institutions and the other nonprofit organizations is that people of color in the United States are disproportionately likely to be extremely low income renters. And what this does, it does put them at greater risk of rental debt. Now, the last presentation spoke to the challenges of having being of lower income or having more expenditures than income coming in. This is especially true for low income renters. So extremely low income renters, and this is a chart that was developed by the National Low Income Housing Coalition. The striped bars there on the top are the percentage of households that are extremely low income renters. And how that's defined is those who are below the poverty line for 30% of area median income. The disproportionality is pretty staggering, not only when you look at home ownership, but when you look at the extremely low income renters, where 19% of Black non-Latino households are extremely low income renters. Compare that to white non-Latino, 6%. So they are already at a disadvantage because of the lower income and having the extremely low income renters of accruing additional debt. So let me just forward the slide here. Hold on one second. There we go. Oop, let me go back one more. So we decided to dig even further and identify that these uneven risks levels do translate further into this disparity issue on rental debt and utility insecurity. So there were three research articles that were looking at this related to homelessness and risk of homelessness. In January 21, there was a survey of over 4,000 Americans that asked the question, what percentage of them had rental debt, percentage of renters had rental debt. And over half of Black renters had stated that they had rental debt. The study in the middle used administrative data. This is from the University of Pennsylvania, that found that Black and Latino residents were much more likely to be rent burdened and experience utility insecurity. So with debt, rental debt, utility insecurity is also a big factor. In my years of working in homeless services, it was very clear that those go hand in hand. Not only do extremely low renters oftentimes get behind on rent because maybe they lost a job or maybe they had a medical debt that they had to pay off, or they had to buy food instead of pay rent, but that goes hand in hand with utilities. So between rental debt and utility debt, it becomes much more difficult to rent affordable housing. So what this, the study in the center found that areas with a higher density of Black and Latino residents had much higher enrollment in utility assistance programs, had electrical bill arrears, and utility disconnections. And in the third one there on the right is that in looking at a research project looking at census data on renters that were behind on rent as of August 21, the 2/3 of renters with arrears in August were people of color. This is, when you look at the homeless population across the United States, and this has been the case since we started enumerating homelessness, that homelessness and almost every community in the United States is disproportionately Black and people of color, right? There's rarely one community in the US where the homeless population looks like the general population. The disproportionality is staggering. And when you layer this on, you see the disproportionality among rent arrears and poverty and low income, this being one of the big drivers for people entering in homelessness. So we've identified there's some resources that are available as communities try to dig into this issue. I just want to highlight a couple of, one resource that we've identified is a map. Sorry, I'm still struggling with the slide deck here. So give me 1 second, let me go back to one. So there's resources out there that can help inform communities and community leaders around this issue of debt and debt burden. And with the idea that these resources can help inform them of developing strategies, more targeted strategies towards this issue. So this is an example of a rent debt dashboard that's developed by the National Equity Atlas and the Right to City Alliance. What it does is uses data from the Census Bureau, Household Pulse Survey, and American Community Survey to really track the number of characteristics of renters behind on debt and estimated total rent debt. Why this is important as rental debt and having groups that are really low income renters, identifying where in their communities these folks live, so there can be proactive outreach, proactive resources to support them so that they don't fall into homelessness. So just again one resource that we've uncovered. There's also a lot of resources available through the Eviction Lab that can help inform this as well when it comes to some of the eviction data. The analysis of dashboard data, we dug into this, that again solve very similar things, right? That people of color were much more likely to be behind on rent than people that were not of color. It's time and time again we saw very similar outcomes. As mentioned in the previous presentation too, we see very similar disproportionality when we look at different types of debt, right? So people of color in the U.S. do experience much higher rates and amounts of medical debt, criminal legal debt, and student loan debt compared to people not of color, right? This, when we think about legal debt, especially for folks that are experiencing homelessness, how this can snowball pretty easily, right? How somebody can get a ticket for jaywalking, for example, in some communities, or somebody could get a minor misdemeanor ticket for speeding, maybe somebody living in their car. That can snowball, right? And it becomes more and more difficult for those folks to get out of that debt burden. And the direct line to the housing is that if they have debt on their record, it is much less likely that a landlord will rent to them, or that they could open up a utility account because of that debt. So what we do here again in Community Solutions is that we work with communities to really understand and develop strategies to help control and reduce the number of people coming into homelessness. So what we've done is we've really, and through our work with communities and our community investments or pass-throughs, we've really encouraged communities to continue to provide this kind of debt relief. Again, as we know, it's a major contributor to homelessness and prolonging homelessness. Continue to provide debt relief regardless of the amount. The social costs of homelessness are staggering. We've looked at some data, some research that shows that individuals who have long-term homelessness can incur upwards of $35,000 a year in medical costs, criminal legal costs. And what we're trying to do is work with those communities to reinforce that paying down some of this debt can be help those communities reduce costs in other areas. So continue to provide debt relief for individuals and families experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Second piece is having a clear idea. One of our core values here in Community Solutions is that you're not going to know what to do to solve a problem unless you know the scope and the scale of the problem. And so working with communities to really understand that racial distribution of debt burden in communities, and the dashboard that I shared earlier, as well as other resources, can help inform communities of where targeted intervention and support could be provided to communities for proactive outreach and resource allocation to those communities so that folks don't enter into homelessness in the first place. The third one is, and this is challenging because we don't have an unlimited pot of money, across communities, but trying to avoid assistance limits that continue to reinforce inequitable debt burdens. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key pieces of feedback that we have been receiving from our communities is that because they had set limits on the amount of money an individual household could receive, they were actually serving, they weren't serving as many people of color as what they should have, partially because of these assistance limits. So really, one of the things when we're thinking about, reducing debt in the homelessness sector is for communities to identify if there's ways to avoid those debt or those assistance limits so that those with the highest rates of debt, highest debt burdens, can have that debt removed so that they can find housing. So again, just taking a bit of a different lens on the issue and the staggering, a challenge that individuals falling into at risk or falling into homelessness, debt becomes a major issue for them, especially when it comes to rental arrears and utility arrears. And what we want to do is really highlight this issue across communities, as it is such a contributing factor to folks entering into homelessness and then prolonging their homelessness. Again, we have a website that has a number of resources available around our movement, around the Built for Zero movement, as well as some of these issues around debt and disproportionality. And I really do encourage you to take a look and look forward to any questions you might have at the end of this webinar. So Linda, I'll turn it back over to you.
Adam, thank you for that excellent presentation. Audience, one of the materials that you will receive tomorrow will be a fact sheet from Community Solutions. So you will have that information and the website and all the information that you will need to connect with Community Solutions. Adam, thank you again. Our next speaker is Dr. Rodgers. Dr. Rodgers, are you ready to make that case for economic equity?
I sure am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. I'm participating from my phone here. Again, echoing my fellow panelists, I want to thank the organizers and Linda Nelson for asking me to participate today. In some respects, I was thinking about this. I could have gone first, but I think it also makes sense of me going last. And that may be for those who are, skeptical, or maybe they need more. You need more than a social justice argument or a set of arguments for pursuing equity. And if so, that's what I'm going to try to provide you. It's some work that I've been doing on prior to coming to the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, but it's really accelerated over the last 2 years when the Institute was created and I was asked to become the director. The Institute for Economic Equity, for those who don't know or haven't followed, is a research group of scholars in the community development part of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. It's coming up on its second year. And our mission, our goal is all about helping people understand the role that structural barriers, hurdles, pick your metaphor of challenge, but the big point is that they're structural. They can have their origins from past public policy or current public policy. They could have their origins. These barriers could have their origins from societal values or views, right? That permeate and lead people to act in certain ways that create barriers to individuals. And I also want to be clear, when we're talking about the equity, we are concerned about equity for young non-college educated Blacks and young white men. We are concerned about prime age Latino men, prime age people with a disability, but also people who are white. We are concerned about the growth in general inequality that's occurred since the 1980s, and a portion of that, which has been shown by research, can be attributed to structural barriers. And as I said, either through policy, in our practices. So, what I'm going to do though is I'm going to probably focus more on my equity conversation on particularly issues around race. But as I said, because of the size of the populations that I'm going to share with you, this is not, the equity issues are not solely something that is impacting Blacks and Latinos and other groups. It's impacting all low to moderate income individuals in their communities. So I have an overview slide of where I'm going to go. I'm going to try to limit myself to about 20 minutes here. And basically, first we're going to offer you some inventory questions, and that basically through the course of the presentation, the answers to those questions will arise. And then I'm going to talk about cases for economic equity, and that's really what in my intro here, what I'm trying to get at is that my panelist colleagues have shown you the racial disparities and with regards to debt and wealth and how that translates into disadvantages or challenges. Well, what I want to go beyond, I want to go beyond just a social justice rationale or argument based on research to pursue equity, but to also talk with you about two types of court cases for equity. One is what I'm calling a resource-based, and you're going to learn about ALICE and an ALICE framework that's been created to think about this. And then the second one that's gotten a lot of interest throughout my region where I've been traveling, and actually throughout the U.S. where I've been traveling, and that is a business case for equity. If we have time in the presentation, formal presentation, but hopefully in the Q&A, I can talk with you about a historical case for equity and again, all these are based on research that we've developed at the Institute. And then I call my frame oil filter commercial case for equity, and it's simply a case for the phrase that from that commercial 1970s, you can pay me now, you can pay me later. And that we've had a lot of deferred maintenance in what the United Nations calls human priorities. And whenever that's occurred, when we've slowed down our investments in human priorities as a share of GDP or gross domestic product, we've seen a growth in income inequality. Then shifting from there, we'll just talk briefly about, from my perspective, I'm a labor workforce economist, and so a lot of my work on equity and the solutions for equity centers around skills and competencies, narrowing gaps between those two, creating a balanced workforce. Helping families achieve a balance with their work and their caring for their family. And then third, research shows the importance of having safe and fair workplaces. But what's really neat is all three of those connect into the debt conversation, connecting the debt. And I like to think about the debt conversation as one of, we need to improve, and based upon the research, financial inclusion. So we'll go to the next slide. And here's some questions for you. We're going to just lightning round go through them. As I said, the answers will come as we proceed through the deck. The first question is, what does ALICE stand for, or who is ALICE? And then the second question is, what share of households are ALICE? And I'll give you a little bit of a hint. The first A stands for assets. I'll let you figure out what you think the LICE stands for. What state has the largest in percent ALICE population? And it's a southern state. If the nation narrowed racial and ethnic household income gaps, how much would disposable income expand for each group? What would that look like for Black households? What would that look like for American Indian households? What would that look like for Latino households? Fourth question, which sector of the economy would see the greatest increase in expenditures as a result of pursuing household income equity? And the hint there, it's going to be related to ending homelessness, as Adam talked about. Last question for you to consider is, how would you pursue equity in your community? How would you pursue, or what kinds of things would you do or are doing to pursue equity in your community? And hopefully you'll share some of those in the chat and in the conversation. All right, let's talk about, and then we'll have a conversation. Next slide. As I said, financial inclusion is a key ingredient to economic equity. As discussed, right, wealth provides opportunities. My colleagues Lowell Ricketts and Anna Kent have a really great piece in our annual State of Economic Equity, where they stress the importance of entrepreneurship and innovation that occurs if we were in more communities, if we were to pursue wealth equity. Wealth provides opportunities to buy goods without needing financing and build a retirement nest egg. What is the challenge, though? The challenge is there's large and persistent wealth gaps that my panel of colleagues did an outstanding job of sharing. We have a piece coming out of one of our blogs on the economy at the St. Louis Fed by Lowell and Anna that will be updating some wealth estimates for readers. So we're excited. You'll be seeing that in the next few weeks. Disparities in credit reporting and scoring, student loans and other debt, predatory lending practices, and then it hasn't been talked about, but banking deserts, right? Banking deserts. Just as analogous, because there are food deserts, there are banking deserts. Right? Let's talk about ALICE. So go to the next slide, please. This chart or graph is showing you the percent of households below the ALICE threshold in 2021. Now, in the notes there, you'll see the definition of ALICE. ALICE stands for asset limited, income constrained, employed. And basically, these are households in your community who do not earn enough to afford the basics where they live. So it's a community-based estimate of a survival budget. And so for the U.S., into 2021, 41% of all U.S. households lived at or below the ALICE threshold. And now what's important here is this living below this threshold is yes, a portion of them are people who are in poverty as defined by the federal government, but most of these people live above the poverty line. Most people live above the poverty line. So what that means is you all know them. You all know ALICE. ALICE can be the firefighter in your community. ALICE can be a nurse or teacher. ALICE is that young college graduate who hasn't been able to find a position within their own the major that they chose. So ALICE works hard, and since you have 41% of households, American households, that are living at or below the ALICE threshold, this is solely not a race issue. That this is an issue that's touching all workers or all low and moderate income families and communities. Mississippi, MS, they have 52% of their households are living below the ALICE threshold. And I don't have all the other states, but trust me, I mean that Mississippi is the state with the highest ALICE threshold. What's most important for this ALICE conversation, and it's something that this is a perfect slide. This slide and the next slide are perfect slides that you can take home with you and utilize. And here's the story here. Everybody understands the impact on ALICE in terms of not having standard housing, living far from her job, or having substandard childcare, or having no childcare at all. We get that, and that's that first column. This is the impact on ALICE. But the important but the also very important column is that next column called impact on everyone. And simply put, the research is showing that if ALICE hurts, we all hurt. what's an example of that? Well, if Alice is homeless, that the impact on everybody is the cost for shelter, foster care, health care, or if Alice have access to good child care for her children, not only creating problems for herself, it also is going to put a future burden on our education system and other systems in our communities that will be impacted by individuals not being as productive, raised to be as productive as they could be. Next slide. Another example is the impact on everybody. If Alice has less healthy food or not enough food, for me as a labor economist, I go right to labor productivity, which is one of the key ingredients to economic growth. That Alice will be a less productive worker, potentially putting future burden on our healthcare system. Alice will be, as I said, a less productive worker if she doesn't have enough food, and also putting a future burden on social insurances, which aka means that we as taxpayers will be contributing to helping them down the road. So that is Alice in a nutshell. Let's go to the buying power, the business case, and that's going to be slide number 9. Slide number 9. And what I have here for you is by race for Blacks, for American Indians, for Latinos. These are estimates of what I would call the actual and potential buying power for particular minority groups. What does this mean? Well, if you look at Blacks in the black bar, that's an estimate of the actual buying power that Blacks have in the United States. So about $977 billion dollars. Yeah, $1 billion currently. And if you were to pursue equity in the form of narrowing the household income gap between Blacks and whites, that would take you to a buying power, a potential buying power of about $1.6 trillion. Right? So you're moving from $976 billion to $1.6 trillion just if you were to equate median Black and white incomes. Sizable increase for American Indians. It's smaller because just they're a smaller share of the population. So, but if you were to do this in certain communities where there are larger American Indian populations, as a share of those local communities' gross domestic product, it's not trivial estimates. You see Latinos, 1.6 trillion to basically 1.9 trillion dollars, and these are annual estimates. So these are not one-time pops in disposable income. Just to put these in perspective, here, the next slide is just showing you the difference between that actual and the potential. The next slide actually helps you put this into a context that basically that growth in buying power for Blacks is about 3% of the nation's gross domestic product. The growth in Latino buying power from the actual to potential is about 2% of GDP. Next slide. This is one of the answers. This slide contains one of the answers to the first question. What I do is I go to the Consumer Expenditure Survey estimated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or it's collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I look at where people or households typically spend their dollars. And most households spend their dollars in housing and food and transportation, or follow close behind in terms of the shares. This chart just shows you that if you were to pursue equity, this is regarded with Blacks, that the gains, the increase in disposable income, and then hence revenues that get generated by purchasing things and profits that get generated would go to the housing sector, followed by transportation and then food. This is for showing you for the Latino buying power, and it's a similar slide. The largest gains would be the housing sector, housing industry, followed by transportation industry, and then the food sector. Here's some selected buying power estimates for some of our southern states. Georgia comes in as having the largest gain. This is a difference between potential and actual buying power. You also see Illinois would see sizable increases in their buying power in their community. And then you have, what's another interesting one, Louisiana, about $21 trillion dollars. 21 million, excuse me, $21 million. So non-trivial estimates or improvements. And this is just a slide too, next slide 15, showing you the growth in the southern buying power for those selected states and as a share of their local communities' gross domestic product. And so we talk about stimulus in terms of saving the economy over the last through the pandemic and then the Great Recession. Similar kinds of estimates, right, for communities, just if we were to pursue equity in terms of income. The next slide, 16, is just building it out, showing you by metro area. Valdosta, Georgia, our estimates suggest that would be about a 22% increase as a share of their local area's GDP, or Jackson, Mississippi, about 15%. But basically, the median of the 45 deep South metro areas is about 8% of GDP if we, again, in these local areas, if we were to pursue equity. Bottom line, again, not a, we're leaving companies, or we're leaving profits, additional gains on the table by not pursuing equity as vigorously as they might. So summary and conclusions. States and metro areas in the Deep South have the following. They have lower Black-white household income ratios, but regardless of race, they also have very large ALICE populations. Southern economies, especially in the Deep South, could experience the largest gains from pursuing economic equity, not only on racial lines, but also improving ALICE's experiences. Third, businesses in the housing, transportation, and food sectors have the greatest potential for expansion. The next slide, just some questions for you to consider. This is coming at you as a labor workforce person, but I think they do connect strongly to my panelist colleagues. But for me, it's the questions I'm dealing with each day is how do we ensure that workers have the skills that provide lifelong economic security? How do we accommodate workers' needs to balance their jobs and with caring for their families? How do we ensure that all workers have opportunities in America's workforce and that our diverse population works in safe and fair workplaces? And the common thread is like strengthening financial inclusion. And one of these approaches, or one of the ways of improving financial inclusion, is addressing these debt issues that have been very long and persistent by race, but also affecting all low and moderate income individuals. So let me stop there, and I look forward to a conversation, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rodgers.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Linda.
Thank you to Shehryar, Adam, and Dr. Rodgers for those great presentations. Now, Nelson, I know you have a ton of questions. Are you ready for questions for our awesome speakers?
Yes, I am. I have questions for our speakers. Thank you for those great presentations. We'll start with this question. Someone's asking, do you know of anyone or any organization or any of the speakers, have you looked at how if the tax burden or the tax bill for the bottom 10% were to be reduced, if taxes are reduced, how might that help the situation? And that can be for anyone who wants to jump in.
I don't know. We have not done any analysis at the Institute on that. It's a great question. But I might direct the readers to the Economic Policy Institute, or maybe even the Center for American Progress, but definitely the Economic Policy Institute.
Great, thank you. That's Dr. Rodgers, right?
That was Dr. Rodgers, yes. That was Bill speaking.
Then someone's asking, what actions can community financial counselors and university professors implement to reduce these disparities other than, say, straight advocacy work?
I mean, I will, as being a university professor up until about 3 years ago, and I'm on leave from Rutgers, but one of the things that I did relatively early in my career, people remember the whole living wage conversations that were going on in the late 1990s. I had just come back from the Labor Department, and we were having a public conversation around improving the wages of our landscapers and housekeepers at the college. And one of the and the president was in a logjam politically because of his board, whose board were represented or their backgrounds. And so I approached the president, the provost, and the dean, and I said, I can solve the problem. I said, what we can do is let's build a business case for increasing the wages of your landscapers and housekeepers. And so we built, they asked me, well, so what do you need? I said, well, give me a committee. And so we had a committee similar to what Harvard did several months after us. But we basically showed when you're paying the people $7.50 and $8 an hour, and it's been going on for decades, that these individuals have challenges. They're ALICE. They have challenges. And these are the one people we're talking about who have issues with debt and not having access to the appropriate financial assets and getting routed into taking on unhealthy debt. So what we ended up doing, we showed that those jobs had the highest turnover. They had the greatest lowest level of morale. And we then made suggestions on where to bump up those wages. So as a college professor, we did this as a college professor, and so this is there are still many communities, many universities and colleges where these issues still abound. And so utilizing that your talents, your research skills can be helpful to, as in this case we did, to grow the economy. And I'm like to call myself, or I've been called Alice's brother. I actually helped to create ALICE, that concept that I shared with you earlier. So again, there's lots to be done where you can utilize your research and your quantitative skills to help tell the stories of these families.
Great, thank you. Well, and since you mentioned wages, I'll go ahead and ask this that somebody asked, what are the most effective strategies to address the growing gap between CEOs and worker pay? Any insights on that from anyone?
This is Bill. I can share on that, but if my colleagues want to talk, I don't want to hog the stage here, so to speak.
Go ahead, Bill, and then they can chime in after as well if they have something to add.
Okay. Sure. There's been a whole large research volume of studies that have been done, particularly starting in the 1980s, and that's where we began to see growing income inequality overall, but also between college graduates and high school graduates, between, as the question was asked, CEOs and mainline workers, and basically, the summary comes down to we've saw over this period of time since the 1980s. And I'm just reporting what the research says, and that is there's a massive decline in union membership, and it's well known that on average people who are members of unions earn about 10 to 15% more than non-union workers. So when you have a much smaller segment of your workforce that is directly covered by a union contract, or could be influenced, their wages or compensation could be influenced by a union contract. That has helped explain the growing income inequality that we've seen. We've also seen that the last time the federal minimum wage was increased was in, I believe, 1995, and then there were 2 consecutive increases, and that's been the last time we've raised the federal. But the interesting thing that's going on, this is one of my projects actually, is looking at the state minimum wage. That since 2021, each January there have been around 19 to 20 states that unilaterally have raised their minimum wage, and the research has been showing they have not that not just these increases but other increases have not led to major job loss. That the idea that there's going to be widespread job loss, that's just not the case that we've been seeing in the minimum wage research. And the work that I'm doing right now, it's preliminary, is showing that these three periods where you really are seeing significant shifts in the wage distribution. And one of the questions that we want to ask is, next question we're asking is, do states that have have these minimum wage increases over the last 2 to 3 years, do we see that the real wages, or do we see that low and moderate income individuals in those communities, in those states, are saying that yes, inflation has hit them, but not as hard? So those are two big things, two big institutional features of our economy that have played a role. Many people have thought that this tight economy, we've had the unemployment rate, national unemployment rate, at or below 4% for I think the last 16 consecutive months, and even before inflation started, wages were still pretty stagnant. And why am I mentioning the tight economy? Well, people have been saying, all you need is a tight economy to shift the balance of power from these CEOs or from management back to workers. And there's been an increase in strike activity or union voice, as led by Liz Shuler, who's the president of the AFL-CIO. But in our work that we'll be publishing in the next few months, we are showing that yes, gains have been made because of this tight economy, but the research is suggesting you need more institutional responses, such as those that I've mentioned and others and things that my colleagues have mentioned.
Excellent, thank you. And Adam, during your presentation, someone asked about illegal evictions. I don't know if you have more information about that or how that may be impacting debt disparities.
Yeah, so definitely, we haven't done any kind of like deeper review of that issue. We know it's an issue though, illegal evictions. And then the other fact is that there's a lot of there are evictions that are not formal evictions, they're mutual rescissions, which it prevents somebody from getting an eviction on a record, but it also leads to folks incurring additional debt. So it's not something we've done deep research into, but we know it's something that is an issue that is coming up in communities.
Excellent, thank you, Adam. And then Shehryar, this may be for you. Somebody mentioned here that they saw that the Aspen report supports greater restriction of non-competes. Did the authors consider licensing reforms, particularly for high-cost professional services like legal, medical, and financial?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes, I'm unmuted now. Okay, great. Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, we did consider that, and that shows up, I believe, in another report that we have that called 101 Solutions for Inclusive Wealth Building, which was kind of laying out like the full range of solutions we could consider. In our more recent report, the New Wealth Agenda, we were really kind of narrowing down to those that we thought would have the most impact. And as we were reviewing the evidence, occupational licensing reform, while it definitely would matter and would have an impact, that it wouldn't be as outsized as some of the other things we include in there, such as looking at corporate concentration.
Okay, thank you. And then Dr. Rodgers, somebody is asking you specifically, has the Institute considered the impact of Federal Reserve accounts for individual citizens to help provide financial services and fiscal support?
At this date, we have not, but I will take that back to my colleagues. That's an interesting question. Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then somebody's asked if anyone has looked, if anyone can address how maybe bank fees, such as low balance fees, debit card overdraft, and ATM fees, can erode the small amount of savings for people living paycheck to paycheck, and how this might keep financially vulnerable families unbanked and exacerbate disparities in wealth development. Not sure if you have any research on that or want to point us to resources or any feedback.
Yeah, this is Professor Rodgers, Dr. Rodgers, Bill Rodgers. We have a project called the Bank On project at the Institute, and also with our colleagues in our community partnerships and investments group. We together constitute or comprise our community development function in St. Louis. And this Bank On project has two components to it. It has a research component, but it also has a component of it where we are working with banks. My colleagues in the community partnerships and investment side of the house, they are working with banks and trying to get them to sign a pledge, as I understand it, to that where they will be committed to providing financial tools that are appropriate for low and moderate income individuals. And we have a report that's largely descriptive that comes out each year and at our website that describes where we are today with this project. So it's very important. That was made reference to it a little bit when I talked about banking deserts. Just as there are food deserts, there are these banking deserts where, as you in the question you described, Nelson, people are not participating. Either they're non-banked, or if they are, they're in financial tools that are actually harmful to them, not just the short term, but the long term.
Great, thank you. Medical costs were mentioned earlier, medical bills. Someone's asking, can anything be done about the high cost of ambulance bills that often hit lower income folks?
I'm sure there must be, but I don't know off the top of my head. So part of this has been my wanting to participate was also doing this is I'm still considering myself on my learning or my listening tour, and just hearing what folks are concerned about and reacting to that or responding to that with potentially new research agenda. We actually have a project that has been going on right now where we've been visiting about 16 total communities within the 8th district, which the 8th district is covered by Arkansas, Missouri, Southern Indiana, Southern Illinois, Western Tennessee, Northern Mississippi, and I think I said Arkansas. But we've been canvassing and chatting with folks, and the prompt that we've been focused on is with this, particularly these tight labor markets. What's still preventing people from participating in the workplace, and so. This question particularly has not come up yet, but what has come up around health care or medical care or health issues has been the mental health challenges that a lot of people are facing, whether anxiety and depression, and then also issues around addiction. So those are big. Those have been major pieces that have come back, and the way I, as an economist, get connected to these kind of conversations is there's a new. This is something for people to take back to their communities. There's a new way of thinking around supply side economics. The old supply side economics is we're giving tax cuts to the wealthier, to businesses, but Secretary Treasurer Janet Yellen and others have talked about this modern supply side economics, and what it really is about is taking advantage of this relationship that productivity of workers plus the labor force growth is equal to economic growth, and that actually had many of those solutions that were talked about by panelists colleagues focused on that productivity piece, right? How do we grow the productivity of workers? Because that's ultimately how you grow or how you expand lifetime prosperity. And so the health questions, anything that can be done to reduce or improve access to medical care. I'll just share a personal story real quickly. My mom, who's very healthy, was out dancing one evening or 4th of July weekend, had a stroke and is slowly recovering. And we're having to start to think about rehab for making decisions. And fortunately, between my brother and my sister and myself and my father, we've got a lot of networks, and we're in and some limited expertise. But I can only imagine what it would be like for someone who doesn't have those resources. And so, improving access and information and having advocates for those individuals, when they're in those situations, is so important.
Great, thank you. And in the interest of time, I'll present one more question, a little bit of a compound question, two-part, and everyone's welcome to chime in if you have anything to say about it. But first, just a little bit more about the bank on program you mentioned. If there are people who think, if I open a bank account and put money in a deposit account, can the bank, will the bank help itself to my money if I end up owing fees, like we talked about earlier about fees? What's being done to prevent that from happening? Are there protections in place? How strong are they? And then also the other question, just to wrap it all up, is what's being done to financially educate high school students, college students, to prevent the future generations from having to deal with these kinds of disparities? And then after that, we'll turn it back to Linda. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Nelson, you want me to jump in on that real quickly?
Sure. And then if anyone else has thoughts on the young generation, educating the young generation.
Yeah. I can answer those. And there are going to be more referrals for people. But with regards to the first question, I think I would recommend people to come to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank and find our Bank On program, and there'll be more information there about it. So that's the first place I would go to get additional information to answer these kinds of questions. Then on the second question, and the reason why I jumped at it too, is that all the Federal Reserves, there's the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in D.C., but then there's also these 12 regional banks, like St. Louis is one of these 12. Well, each of them have economics of education programs. They all differ based upon the needs that people feel in their communities, but one of the common threads is around helping to improve economic education, K through 12 on up through undergraduate and even graduate school. So that's another place I would recommend people if they're looking for information about tools or about activities to improve the economic education of young people. I would recommend people go there. So that's my last thing I'm going to say. I'm going to listen now.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah.
I can jump in on the financial education question. So in one of our previous reports, we highlighted one model of delivering financial education, which is the Ariel Community Academy, which combines education and practice, by letting the students there observe an investment portfolio design for them and discuss it with industry professionals, and it kind of gets them, acquainted with finance at a young age, and with a practical element as well. So perhaps through that program, there are things that people can model off of that. Another thing that sort of goes beyond financial education, though, is programs that could automatically enroll youth into savings programs. For example, 529 savings programs for higher education. That starts to normalize the idea of having investments and having savings at a very early age. And that's also part of the idea when people are talking about early wealth building accounts, like the children's savings accounts, like baby bonds that are coming more into the scene. That makes finances, much more real for people when they're young. And just having that in your life can make you better prepared for the long term.
Great, thank you. If there's nothing else, Linda, we'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Nelson. And again, thank you to our guest speakers for hanging in there and answering those questions. Again, the webinar was presented with funding from Wells Fargo. So a special shout out to Wells Fargo for believing in our mission and funding this webinar. You rock. Thank you. If you would like to contribute to consumer action, you can do so. You can do so online, by credit card, or by using PayPal by going to www.consumer-action.org/giving. Or you can mail us a check. You can write that check out and mail it to Consumer Action and send it to Attention Membership Giving, 57 Post Street, Suite 611, San Francisco, California, 94104. Don't have a check? No worries. You can still support us. You can support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel. It's free and it will help us continue to bring you these great webinars. In fact, we're trying to get 50 new subscribers today. So please help us reach our goal by subscribing today. Speaking of great webinars, please check your box for notifications of our upcoming webinars. Again, a special thanks to our guest speakers for those excellent presentations. I can't wait to hear what you think about today's webinar, so please complete the survey. We value your feedback as we strive to bring you timely, relevant information that's going to make a difference in the lives of the consumers you serve. That is all we have for you today. Thank you for joining us and submitting your questions. A link to today's recording will be released tomorrow, so watch your inbox. Hope to see you soon. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Special thanks to you, Shehryar, Adam, and Dr. Rodgers. A special thanks to you. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye now.